Canada hasn't seen this type of civic mobilization since the Second World War. These are the biggest economic measures in our lifetimes to defeat a threat to our health. These historic measures will support Canadians to stay home to defeat COVID-19.
Extraordinary measures for extraordinary times. Hi there, and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Parliament will be coming back to unlock billions of more dollars aimed at helping Canadians weather the COVID-19 crisis. This time, that money is specifically for businesses. Last week, the feds announced they were boosting their planned wage subsidy from 10% to up to 75%. That subsidy will apply to all businesses, big and small. But to qualify, a business has to prove a 30% drop in revenues compared to the same month last year, and that business will have to do so every month. The subsidy will cover 75% of the first $58,700 of a salary, so that equates to about $847 a week per employee. Employers will also have to attest they're doing what they can to pay the remaining 25%. Finance Minister Bill Morneau today announced the cash will be available 6 weeks from now, and it will cost the Treasury an estimated $71 billion. That's on top, of course, of the CERB, which is available to all Canadians who have lost their income beginning next week. April 6th is the date officially the government announced today that application process will open. So how will the financial help for businesses roll out, and will it really take 6 weeks for the cash to flow? Bill Morneau is the federal finance minister. Hi, Minister Morneau. Thanks for making time for us.
Good to be on your show, Vashi.
Minister, I want to start off by asking about a timeline here. I know you said that the portal for applying for this wage subsidy could be up and running in 3 to 6 weeks. What's the earliest time frame for businesses to actually get their hands on that cash?
Well, that's going to depend not only on our portal, but also on the business themselves. So from our standpoint, what we're doing is we're trying to use the systems that we have to make sure we can get this wage subsidy out to businesses. That means we're using the Canada Revenue Agency. We expect that the ability for people to come online and show us they're paying their employees that 75% wage subsidy will be up in 3 to 6 weeks. We're obviously trying to make that closer to 3. If businesses are direct deposit with the Canada Revenue Agency, which we would encourage them to be in this time period, then the payment will be pretty close to immediate. So the next few weeks, it's going to be up to us to get that system up and running. We're working on it, and for businesses to make sure that they're online with Canada Revenue Agency and have direct deposit. Right now, about 50% of them do, and I'm sure we'll see that number change in the coming weeks.
I'm sure you're hearing from businesses even more than we are, but we're hearing from a lot of owners as well who are worried even about the next 2 weeks. Do you think businesses, particularly smaller ones, really have 6 weeks to wait before they can get their hands on any of this help?
Well, Vashi, we're moving as fast as we can. We know how important this is. We need to make sure that people can get through a really difficult time. It's why we started with that Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We knew that there's 5.7 million of the 19 million people in Canada who work that aren't even attached to a firm. And those people have no revenue almost immediately in many situations. So that will be up and running. It'll be starting next week. The approach for businesses is to make sure that they have access to this wage subsidy for those people that they keep on staff. We think this is very important to keep the employer-employee relationship and allow people to be paid. And we're just going to work to get it out as fast as we possibly can. I know that people are feeling anxious right now. I know we need to move fast. We need to make sure we get the details out, which we will, and we are working to get it out as fast as we possibly can.
Further to the timeline, Minister, has a decision been made on when Parliament will be recalled in order to pass legislation that would enact this?
Well, I know the Prime Minister has asked the House Leader today to get together with all parties to think about how we can move forward in Parliament. I don't have a date for when that's going to happen, but obviously we want to work together. I think we've seen a lot of cooperation. We need to work to support Canadians. This is a time for us to act in a time of crisis in a nonpartisan way. That's certainly what we're trying to do.
Is there a possibility at all that a delay to Parliament resuming would then further delay the implementation of this program?
You know, I'm of the opinion that we're going to be able to work together to get this done. We all see how important this is. We know that people will find themselves in a situation where they just can't afford to live their life without the support that the government's put forward. So that's why working together is important. we're seeing real cooperation across the country with provinces. I think we can expect that everyone's going to work in the best interests of Canadians. That's what we're waking up every morning and doing.
The legislation your government initially put forward to cover the first announcement where financial aid was concerned focused very much on the 10% wage subsidy. Why didn't your government write it in a way that could encapsulate a larger subsidy as you've delivered now?
You know, what we're seeing, Vashi, is that there's challenges that we come up against every day in dealing with this COVID-19 crisis, and we're trying to respond in a way that recognizes those challenges. The initial thing we did was making sure we could get money into people's hands. That first wage subsidy was actually for all small businesses, so any small business to get a 10% wage subsidy, recognizing that pretty well every business is hit in some way. What we're doing today, what we've announced the details of, it's really very specifically for businesses that have been directly hit by COVID-19. So it's for all businesses, large and small, so that they can have a wage subsidy for employees that they have on or that they bring back on. And those people therefore can get up to $847. That's 75% wage subsidy, plus whatever the employer pays on top of that. So it's enabling us to keep more people engaged with their employer while we also find a way to support other people. If we find ourselves in the coming days or weeks with other challenges, I just want Canadians to know that we're going to respond in a way that's appropriate to those challenges. And I'm going to assume, and I think it's reasonable to assume, that all parties will work together to make those things happen if, in fact, we need new legislation to do it. So that's the only way to deal with a challenge like we're facing.
I want to ask you about those possible other challenges, because a number of business owners have told us that they welcome the news, of course, about the wage subsidy, but that for many of them, it won't help them with more immediate fixed costs, such as rent, such as the bills. I mean, today is April 1st. I know your government constantly, when asked about this, talks about the loans, for example, made available through the BDC, interest-free for a year, part of it being forgiven after that year. But a lot of business owners, again, push back on that when we tell them about it, saying that's just us taking on more debt. That's not actually going to help us so much in the long run. Isn't that a fair assessment?
Look, I think we have to start by saying people are really anxious. People who've worked their entire lives to build their business. I understand how challenging that must be for them. What we're trying to do is make sure they can keep their attachment with their employees with this wage subsidy. It is also available for the business owner, so they're going to be in a situation where they have that ability to pay their rent as well. We know that's critically important. The business account, the loans that we're putting in place, they are critical, because what we're saying is for any small business that has $50,000 of payroll, they can get a $40,000 completely interest-free loan, and it's interest-free right until December 31st, 2022. And then when they pay it back by that time, they'll get $10,000 back. So, meaning that it's really only $30,000 they'll need to pay. So I understand that people are facing challenges. Those challenges are real. We're working to support businesses during this time. We're focusing on how we can make sure people can get by. And of course, we'll have to think about other things. But I'll remind you as well that for businesses and individuals, we've deferred any payment of tax through until September. And for retail businesses, we've deferred the paying of GST, which is significant. It's about $30 billion in total for the months of April, May, and June. So this is going a long way to help people. I know that it's still challenging, and we are hearing the issues as you are, and we're trying to respond to them appropriately.
Yeah, Minister, I take your point, but with respect, even $30,000, $40,000, if you're paying commercial rent, the level of commercial rent, you're going to run out of that pretty quickly, even if you do qualify. Because I've already heard from a lot of business owners who've gone to the BDC or their bank, and their bank has said, we're not sure if you're even going to qualify for this. Is there any, I mean, the opposition, the NDP, has asked you to look at some sort of directive from the federal government on rent, for example. I know that it's provincial jurisdiction, but on rent. Or what about the conversations with the banks?
Well, first of all, let me deal with the banking issue. So we just got to this agreement with the banks this past Thursday, so not even a week ago. And when they agreed to administer this $40,000 loan, they said that it would take about 3 weeks for them to get it up and running from an administration standpoint. Recognizing there's over 1 million small businesses in the country, they do need to make sure they can actually do it. So I understand that maybe banks have not reacted immediately because the program actually wasn't there, but it is coming, and I want people to know that that is indeed coming. From a rent standpoint, I can tell you that I've, on a weekly basis, been working with the provincial finance ministers. I had a call with them this past Monday where we went through the rent situation on a province-by-province basis. You correctly pointed out that this is a provincial government jurisdiction, and in each case they talked about how they're trying to work together with the sector to see about how they can help in rent. In many cases, they're ensuring that there are no evictions, in particular on the individual side. So, look, we know that there's things that we're going to need to continue to think about. We also know that the wage subsidy is going to have a very, very big impact on many businesses because now they're in a situation where they have more access to cash. The GST tax deferral is going to be very important, and that loan is going to be very important. Of course, $10,000 of it being forgivable if they pay it back. So there's many things we're doing, Vashi, and I know people are going to continue to feel stressed through this situation. We're going to be there for people and importantly make sure that they find a way to support their families during this time.
You said, Minister, last week, though, that you were in conversations with the banks about interest rates, not only where mortgages and other lending is concerned, but on credit cards. Where do those conversations stand? Because so far, nobody has seen any difference.
Well, actually, I didn't say that, Vashi. What I said was that I was in negotiations with the banks around making sure that people have access to credit. And of course, when you have access to credit, you can, if you want to, redo your approach to your own personal situation. So that's what we were trying to achieve.
So you don't have any issue with the interest rates credit card companies and banks are charging right now?
What I want to make sure that people have is access to credit during this time of challenge. And so that's why we've put in place this ability for small businesses to get interest-free loans. So there's no interest at all on those because they're 100% guaranteed by the federal government. On top of that, what we were negotiating with the banks is for them to have credit for larger businesses, and we did that as well with the federal government providing an 80% guarantee, which means the banks have to put 20% of their own capital up for loans up to $12.5 million for more mid-sized businesses. So we continue to work with them for facilities for businesses to find a way to bridge during this time. And of course, we're going to work with them to see about ways we can help Canadians. I can say the banks have actually been quite cooperative. They're trying to do their bit to help people, doing things like waiving mortgage payments. They've got, in most situations, each bank has said that they'll allow people to skip a payment on their credit cards or on their auto loans.
With respect, though, they'll still be penalized for that, right? No bank has forgiven, for example, paying interest on that. You're still going to be penalized, and the credit card companies are not charging lower interest rates right now. That's what I'm asking about, because that's what we're hearing about from Canadians right now.
I understand, but what the banks are doing is displaying a level of flexibility in trying to help people during this time, and we're going to continue to work with them to make sure that we're supporting Canadians.
Thank you so much, Minister. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.
That's the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. As you just heard, the government will have to bring MPs back to Parliament for a second time during this pandemic to pass their emergency measures. And Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland is hoping opposition MPs are on board.
I really believe that the opposition in the House will work with us in the spirit in which we are working on these issues, which is understanding that now is not a time for partisanship. Now is a time for a true Team Canada effort.
So will opposition parties support the wage subsidy in principle? What more do they want to see? Andrew Scheer is the leader of the Conservative Party and is in Regina. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Thanks for making time for us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We got some new details from the federal government where the wage subsidy is concerned today, and understanding the caveat that Parliament will, it sounds like, likely resume to vote on whatever legislation they put forward. Based on what you heard from the federal government today on the details of the program, do you support it in principle?
Well, we support helping businesses keep people employed during this very difficult time. In fact, when the government first came out with its announcement saying that it would only be 10%, we flagged that that was not going to be sufficient for so many small businesses across the country. What's really concerning, though, is their massive blunder. They recalled the House of Commons last week, attempted to grab power for themselves, and goofed up on their own legislation so badly that now they need to recall Parliament just to fix the errors and the gaps that their original legislation had. So, this government is not instilling a lot of confidence in Canadians right now. They make announcements with no plans to follow through, and they bring in legislation that doesn't match their programs.
My understanding, Mr. Scheer, is that the original legislation was specific to the 10% wage increase. They hadn't yet announced this 75%, or it appears developed the program to enact it. Doesn't it make sense then that they would have to amend the legislation to better reflect the new financial aid package?
The issue with that line of logic from the Liberals, though, is this idea that an increase in the wage subsidy was some kind of a new idea. This was something that we had been calling for. This is something that businesses had been calling for. They wrote the legislation very clearly last week, just to have a couple of days later their own announcement indicate that they made errors in the original bill. So this is completely on them. And when you're dealing with a massive crisis, when you're trying to instill confidence in Canadians that the government is going to see individuals and businesses through this difficult time, getting it right the first time is essential.
Do you support the way that they've laid it out, being that it's 75% any size employer, but the employer will have to prove, or the business will have to prove, a 30% reduction in revenue, kind of this month compared to the same month last year? Do you think that system? Do you support that system in principle?
Well, I think in principle, to show that a company, in order to receive government funds, can show some type of impact of this pandemic is something that we would generally support. But we have a lot of concerns about the ability of the government to actually implement what they're saying. We found out today that the government is talking about a 6-week timeline before businesses are able to access these types of programs. We're 2 months into this crisis. The government has had weeks to prepare a response, to see what's coming. We've seen the impacts in other countries. This is going to be 3 pay periods at least for many Canadians who otherwise for many Canadians who are going to be relying on this type of program. So, we went back to the House of Commons last week in good faith, hoping that they were going to do their homework, come to Canadians with a plan that was well thought out and ready to be delivered. And so far, we're not seeing a lot of signs of that.
It sounds like from the federal government today that the money will be administered through the CRA, through the CRA's system. How would you expedite the process so that money could get into the hands of business owners faster?
Well, we have a lot of concerns about the capacity of government programs during this time of crisis. And we recognize that there's been a huge surge in people, making applications for the employment benefits, for the emergency assistance measures. We understand that that's going to put some strains on resources. Departments that were normally used to handling a fraction of the calls that they are now need to be well staffed so that we can actually get these program dollars out the door and into the hands of people who need it. That's why some of the questions we'll be asking next week will be precisely around how quickly that turnaround time can be. And the more complicated a form you make, the more the more processes it has to go through on the bureaucratic side, the longer the delays. So we're going to be looking for a streamlined approach on this, so that the assistance actually gets in the hands of the people who need it in a timely manner.
Based on what you've heard so far, though, does it seem like the approach is not streamlined? I ask only because it seems as though, and obviously I haven't seen the application firsthand, but it seems as though the CRA, at least that's what they're insisting, is the simplest way, because you can register, for example, for a direct deposit. You're already registered because you pay taxes, that kind of thing.
Well, again, this government has shown it's very good at making announcements, not so good at following through. So we're going to be making sure that is actually the case. We've seen, for example, huge wait times on other intakes for government programs, Service Canada for one, where I hear lots of constituents contacting my office because they can't get someone to answer the phone on the government side. And again, recognizing that this is a huge surge in people looking to government for programs and services, we can understand that. But we are well into this crisis now, and Canadians expect that their government is able to respond and react as the impacts of this are felt in a broader and broader way.
We also hear from a lot of Canadians here who run businesses who are not only concerned about wages but about paying rent. It's a big issue, obviously, given that it's April the 1st. Your counterpart in for the NDP has asked the federal government to insert itself into the conversation around rents, even though it's normally provincial jurisdiction, and figure out a way to almost direct some sort of moratorium on mortgages and rents, because that's getting to be a huge issue. What is your party's stance on that, your position on that?
Well, we of course recognize that many people, it being the first of the month, are in a very precarious position in terms of paying their own rent. We support the measures to get financial assistance in the hands of Canadians that need it the most, so that they are able to, make their mortgage payment, make their rent payment. When it comes to small businesses, one of the things that we've pointed out is that while we support the wage subsidy for those businesses that are still operating and just going through a very difficult period, there are many, many small businesses who will not be able to avail themselves of this program because there are no wages to pay. Restaurants that haven't been open in weeks don't need a wage subsidy because they're canceling shifts, their stores are closed, their restaurants are closed. And so what we're saying is that rather than just defer the GST, as the government has announced, we believe the government should refund that, allow the small businesses to keep it, let them pay their rent, let them make their obligations so that they can stay afloat, so there are jobs for people to go back to. A simple deferral doesn't allow the businesses to actually spend that money, because that money is owed to the government. Whether it's owed in April or owed in July, they still have to write a check based on that cash to the government. We're saying let them keep it so that when this health pandemic is over, that there are jobs for people to go back to. It's critically important that the government listen to this suggestion to keep the small businesses open all across this country. Will
that be enough, though? Like, can you quantify for our audience, if you were to, for example, get a refund for GST remittances, how would that be enough to actually pay the rent?
Well, obviously it would vary from business to business, and obviously it's just a part of the equation. But rather than, many of these businesses would file quarterly, they would have several months worth of GST accumulated. Normally that's left in an account that's not touched because the government always gets paid, and businesses know that they have to make those obligations, otherwise the Canada Revenue Agency comes down on them very, very hard. That's why a deferral simply doesn't accomplish what the government might hope it will accomplish, because no small business owner is going to spend that money when they know that they have to pay it back anyway in June or July. So I believe it's an important part of the formula for keeping businesses afloat is to let them keep the GST that they've already collected.
Beyond that, though, back to my original question on rent. Should provinces, for example, be offering moratoriums on rent?
Mm-hmm. Well, those are questions that I believe every province is going to look at. From our point of view, federally, we believe that when the government does look at making funds available for lending, when the Bank of Canada starts to make policy decisions around the monetary policy of this country, that we have to make sure that there's actually a benefit for individuals. So we're going to be asking those types of questions next week when the House of Commons does come back. We want to find out exactly how what the government has announced around the lending side of this tool, the lending tools that they've announced. We want to make sure that's actually going to help individuals stay in their homes and have some flexibility in the coming months.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
My message to Canada's employers is this: get ready to rehire people. You can apply online through a Canada Revenue Agency portal that will launch soon. Funds will be available in approximately 6 weeks.
Hi there, I'm Vashi Kapelos and you're watching Power in Politics. I'd like to welcome viewers joining us on CBC Television in the Maritime provinces. Great to have you with us tonight. You just heard Finance Minister Bill Morneau speaking about the federal government's emergency measures for businesses affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Businesses experiencing at least 30% of a drop in revenue in the wake of this pandemic will now be eligible for a wage subsidy of up to 75%. The Prime Minister says this is, quote, the largest economic program in Canada's history. But as you heard the minister say, this new relief package won't be available for another 6 weeks at least, and it will require Parliament to be recalled yet again to pass the new program. So when will that happen? And will opposition parties support the aid package? Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the NDP. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you. Thanks for making time.
Hi there. My pleasure. Good to see you too.
So let me just start off with a quick procedural question, if you don't mind. Do you have any word on when Parliament might be resuming to look at legislation on the very wage subsidy the government sort of filled out the details of today?
No, we don't have any details on when that would happen, but we're ready to be back in Parliament. I'm ready to be back on call and any moment's call to be there to pass legislation that's going to help out people in need.
We know the Conservatives immediately on the this morning said this needs to be revisited. It doesn't match, or the original legislation from last week doesn't match up with the what the government is proposing today. Does your party feel the same way? Do you think Parliament has to come back in this instance?
Well, two things. One is on the 75% wage subsidy. It's something that I've been calling for a couple of weeks now. And the very day that we were in Parliament, I pushed to say that 10% is not enough to help out businesses, that other countries have done a lot more. And I called for at least 75% or more wage subsidy. We could have done that when we were in Parliament. I've advocated for it. I believe in it. I support it. I'm happy to see the government announcing it now, but we could have done this when we were in Parliament last week.
Did you have those conversations with the government last week? And if so, what was their response at the time?
Yeah, it's all on the public record. I asked questions in the House. I made it a part of my speech in the House. Questions directly in my speech as well as in private. I spoke with the Prime Minister and raised it. Said multiple times that the 10% is insufficient. We've tweeted it, said it publicly, said it to the Prime Minister directly, said it in Parliament weeks before this, or a week before the announcement, saying that the 10% is just not enough to help families out or to help businesses out and to help workers out, and that other countries have done a lot more. The response was at the time that no, we can't do it, or there was an openness but not a commitment towards doing it.
So now the possibility obviously exists that Parliament will return. You're going to have new legislation to look at. Taking that into account, we don't know what the legislation specifically does look like, but the ideas proposed today, the details that the government released today, on principle, do you support it?
Well, on principle, it's what I've been calling for. I've been saying that we need 75% wage subsidy at least. We need to offer that to small and medium-sized businesses and others to consider. And we need to make sure that the wage subsidy is tied to making sure Canadians have a job to return to. It's a lot easier to keep people employed than to have a massive number of Canadians become unemployed and then have to seek out new jobs in the future. It's difficult for businesses to have to rehire and retrain. It's so much better to have people stay in their jobs and to have them continue to receive payment, to continue to be on the payroll. And so I absolutely support that. We'll, of course, look at the details of the proposals in the legislation, which may be different from what's being said publicly. We'll look at it and review it. But on principle, we know that we need to give immediate help to businesses. My big concern, though, is that based on the Minister of Finance's announcement, it will take far too long for this support to get in place. 6 weeks may be too long now for many businesses who have already suffered almost a month of no or very little and reduced activity. And so another month would be very hard, or more. Another month or more would be hard.
How would you speed that process up, Mr. Singh?
To make this a priority, we need to immediately put in place some supports similar to what I called for the financial supports to families. We know that the application process is going to be really difficult. It's going to take a long time. I've called for the $2,000 to be sent directly to all Canadians, and then we can tax back the amount that's not needed. Those that don't need the amount can return that through taxation in the next cycle. For this case, we just need to find a way to deliver the money quicker and put in place the supports faster. I'm ready to facilitate quick passage of the legislation if that's the hang-up. But we need to work with the Prime Minister, see the legislation, and we can move towards passing it quickly. The goal here has to be urgency for people. We need rental supports, we need mortgage relief, and we need people to be able to have their jobs.
So just so that I'm clear, do you mean that the government shouldn't be using the CRA, for example, in order to distribute the money? Because that's their argument, that it is more streamlined, it is simpler because people are already registered to pay their taxes, they can register now for direct deposit, and that money will go directly to them.
Well, the issue is this, is that anytime you have an application process, that's going to make it more difficult. People are going to have to apply for it. For the help that people need right now, we know that today's rent is due for a lot of people, and they don't have income. They haven't had income for a while. We know how many people have filed taxes. We could send money directly out to people. That's the fastest way, the quickest way to get people help, and that's what I've been calling for. I think we need to move towards a universal basic income during this crisis. We can provide relief, financial support directly to people on a monthly basis while we're in this crisis. We also need to look at how we stop money leaving people's pockets. And the biggest concern I see right now is rent and mortgage. And I'm calling on the government to pause all mortgage and rent, work with all levels of government to make that happen. Because people, if they don't have a home, how can they physically distance? How will they be able to prevent the spread of this illness? We're not going to just have a homelessness crisis, but also a public health emergency.
So there are a number of provinces which, especially for residential rent, have put a moratorium on it. They've also said evictions can't happen, for example. What more do you want the federal government specifically considering that rent, tenant, landlord relationships, that's all provincial jurisdiction?
Well, rent is directly tied to mortgage, and mortgage is very much within the federal jurisdiction. Under the Constitution Act, Section 91, under the Banks Act, federal governments have express jurisdiction over banks, and we can mandate things like pausing mortgage, not asking them to do it, not asking nicely, but mandating that mortgages are paused, and then using that to leverage and work with provinces to ensure that rents are also paused. Right now, there isn't a clear pause on rent. It's not actually expressly put forward that people have the security of knowing that they don't need to pay their rent right now. And to do that, the first step, one of the most important steps, is making sure mortgages are paused. And that is absolutely within the federal jurisdiction.
What kind of spill-on effect might that have on the banking system and general levels of liquidity and lending capacity in this country?
I'm less worried about that. I'm more worried about people not having a home. I'm worried about people that won't have a place to live during a healthcare crisis where we're calling for people to physically distance. I'm worried about people not having a place to live when we're telling them they need to limit the spread of this illness. This is a healthcare crisis. I'm not worried about banks that have powerful, they have wealthy assets, they have significant wealth. I'm worried about people that might lose their homes.
No, I completely take your point in that, and we hear from those Canadians all the time as well. I just wonder, in your analysis, what the potential long-term effects of that are. I take the point about the acute need right now, but that obviously putting a pause on all mortgages in the country would have spill-off effects that could affect the long-term viability of the economy.
Well, we've seen the federal government put forward relief money for banks, but they haven't required that to be strings attached with any clear mandate of pausing mortgages. They floated the idea of deferrals, and deferrals aren't really helping people. They're effectively compounding interest on interest, and they're not really giving people the relief that they need right now. And so I think that we're in a crisis. There's no question about it. There's going to be devastating economic impact, and we need to lessen the impact on people and make sure that people are the ones that aren't paying the price. Those who are the wealthy banking sectors can do their part. There is ways to ensure that they're doing their part to ensure people are not going to suffer during this crisis, and I think that should be our priority.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.